Hello, it's Dr. Ken with my teaching assistant Bear here to give a lecture for my ancient Greece class on the topic of gender in ancient Greece. So my teaching assistant, who's an expert on these things, will stay close by to offer her advice as and when needed. Yeah, okay. And we'll get on with it. So before we begin, I think some clarification of terms. Um, I will use generally the term gender to refer to the kind of socially constructed and identity oriented aspects of masculinity and femininity, whereas sex refers to the biological sex of the individual, male, female, or intersexed, or a range of other things. This is an important, I think, distinction to make. Many people use gender and sex indiscriminately or interchangeably, but if we stick to these definitions, I think that things will be a bit clearer. So gender, again, is that sort of constructedness, both within society and the individual, about masculine and feminine roles. So on that topic, I have a quote here from Hector in the Iliad by Homer, talking to his wife Andromache when she advises him on the war. Pardon me, and he says, "Go into the house and see to your tasks, the loom and the distaff, and bid your handmaidens go about their work. War will concern men, all those born at Troy, and me especially." So go into the house, tend to your women's work. That's the attitude. And this would get quoted not just in, the time that Homer was writing or composing the Iliad, but certainly long after. In Plato's Laws, by contrast, he has the Athenian stranger characters say the following: "To allow the female to live in luxury, spend money, and follow disorderly pursuits, while supervising the male, is to grant only half of a totally happy life, instead of double that for the city. And it is unusually Plato's position that women as a resource should not be wasted in the way that they are, but should be educated alongside men and given more or less equal rights." I say more or less, he's still not, he doesn't commit 100%, but then again his society wouldn't probably have let him. Finally, from Lysistrata by Aristophanes, a line from the main character here referencing that famous quote from Homer that I gave earlier. She says, "Then card wool and work it delicately whilst munching beans. War will be women's business," where the women in the play decide to stop the war by going on sex strike. So these are, and the reason I quote these, especially the Iliad and that bit from Aristophanes, is to illustrate how these people, how people were processing or understanding gendered roles. And moving along then, we'll think about how we understand ancient Greek concepts of gender with recourse to the sort of evidence, right? And this is a problem. This is always a problem with ancient issues, and ones where they haven't explicitly told us, or I'm not sure that they were able to tell us what everyone thought or believed about sex and gender. Can we do this for our society today? It's pretty complicated, although there's been a lot written. What you will observe from the image is that virtually all the sources, pretty much apart from Sappho, are men. And that's not surprising given the society at the time. We would expect that to be the case, but it means that the perspective of women is coming mainly from men. And in the case of Sappho, she's a poetess from a different century from the one that we're mainly looking at. Pardon me, and certainly not representative of most women. So Xenophon, I'll go through them one by one. Xenophon gives us a lot on gender, particularly in his Constitution of the Spartans and the Oikonomikos. Xenophon was a student of Socrates, like Plato, and practiced philosophy. He was also an historian, and we'll recall from last time that he was a pro-Spartan, what we would call a conophile. In one of the treatises, which we'll be looking at by Xenophon, or a section of it, the Oikonomikos, household management, it puts forward an image of kind of upper class, upper middle class domestic bliss in terms of how those marriages, how those male-female relationships were seen to work. So in that case, in the instance that we have that we'll be looking at in class, you have Ischomachos, the character. It's a fiction. It's a conversation with Socrates. It's a bit like Plato's dialogues. But the character Ischomachos has married a wife who's about 15 years old. He's a good bit older. We don't know how old exactly, but we assume late 20s, early 30s, if not older. And he's educating her, he's training her in household management. And he puts forward this sort of essentialist view that this is, an essentialist means, the gender roles are defined by natural forces or by God or something along those lines. So he puts forward the essentialist view: the gods have made us this way, that men are best suited for being in the outdoors and working in the public sphere, and women for the private sphere because they, of course, give birth. These are old issues and still with us very much today in the modern politics of gender. But in Xenophon's Oikonomikos, we learn all sorts of things about how women are supposed to behave, and we know that when the women of that class went out of doors, I mentioned this before, that they would wear a veil, usually, and they'd be accompanied by either their husband or another male relative or an older female relative as a kind of escort. Now, that was seen as the ideal for members of, again, of the upper and middle to upper classes. It was not the way that most people lived. Most women in Athens probably did go out and work in the public sphere because they had to. But so you can't say, and don't say in your essays, they all went out and wore the veil and had to be supervised. They weren't. It was mainly women of the upper and middle classes, and this is, of course, because of issues like inheritance, concern over the sanctity of the offspring's parentage, these sorts of things. Although, as I say, that was spun as the ideal, and I think many in the lower classes would have aspired to that sort of existence. And the Oikonomikos, as I say, is a kind of guide. It's not saying this is how it is. He's saying this is how it should be. It's an idealized representation, so it may not even reflect reality that much amongst the class that it's intended for. In terms of other sources, we have the forensic speeches of individuals like Lysias and Aeschines. So in Lysias 1, we have the murder of Eratosthenes. This is a speech in defense by the person accused of this man's murder, who's caught this man in bed with his wife and killed him. The law, as it turns out, allows this, but it was extremely rare that that sort of thing should happen at all. Usually, if someone caught someone in bed with their wives, they would divorce the wife immediately and then give the guy a fine, take him to court and make him pay a fine. There might be ritual humiliation involved, dragging the man out into the street and shoving various vegetables up his posterior. This is called a radishing, raphanodoses in Greek. But killing him was very unusual. It looks like this guy Euripides has done this, and he's defending himself in the family of the murdered man. I dare say he was murdered. It was premeditated. It wasn't a crime of passion. He knew it was going on, gathered his mates together and confronted them in the act. So it was definitely premeditated. But it reveals a lot about the role of women and how especially of that social class, how they were segregated, from the rest of society, kept at home. She meets her lover Eratosthenes at a funeral, one of the few occasions that women would go out. So that forensic speech is incredibly useful. There are lots of other ones too, dealing with, for example, prostitutes and high-class women, foreign women who get involved in notorious events. The other one is by Aeschines that I'm going to mention here, the case against Timarchus, and this is a forensic speech that accuses, Aeschines has written it himself, he's delivering the speech, he's accusing Timarchus of having prostituted himself with men for money. And the law is that if an Athenian citizen, a male citizen in particular especially, should do this, should prostitute himself, he's barred from public speaking. He's not allowed to serve in public office or deliver speeches before the assembly. And in this case, Timarchus is found guilty. Now, it turns out there's a whole other dimension to this behind the scenes. Aeschines wants to get Timarchus gagged from public speaking because Timarchus is going to prosecute him, or was planning to, for having misled the Athenian people. It turns out Aeschines had negotiated a treaty with the kingdom of Macedon that turned out to be quite favorable for the kingdom of Macedon, and he may well have been bribed a large sum of money to do this. This is what Timarchus was going to accuse him of. If he had been found guilty, Aeschines could have faced either the death penalty or probably permanent exile. So he's got an interest in getting Timarchus banned. But we'll look through that speech because it goes over a lot of, again, issues about male sexuality and gender roles and certain preconceptions about these things. There was, we're told, an appeal in a couple of years because some of the witnesses weren't able to, or about a year later, some of the witnesses weren't able to come to the first trial, and even though Timarchus was found guilty in the first trial, he was acquitted in the second one. So he may never have been guilty of prostituting himself, and it's unclear exactly what he's done, except maybe he slept with some men who may have given him presents, but Aeschines accuses him of taking money essentially for sex. That's another point we'll come up with too. I'll talk about hetairai in a bit. The other source, of course, the one that we're looking at is Aristophanes, right? The plays. Gender roles and conflicts are very much a part of the subject under scrutiny in these plays. Throughout, Aristophanes shows women to be drunks, gluttons, adulterous, deceitful, and obsessed by sex. Yet these traits can be addressed as reflections of male anxieties about women. So you get very stereotypical views of women in Aristophanes reflecting male prejudices. But you also get women in positions of power, like Praxagora in the Assemblywomen, who talks like a man. Her name even means she who does stuff in public. And Lysistrata herself, who also talks like a man, giving speeches to the assembly and so forth. So Aristophanes uses a lot of comic exaggerations, inversions of the norm, playing up to stereotypes. This is for comedy purposes. We don't think he's advocating that women should take over the state or try and stop a war with a sex strike, but he puts forward some rather interesting views. And in keeping with Aristotle's criticism of comedy, comedy presents people as worse than they really are. But what he's getting at is that these are exaggerated views. So again, what does Aristophanes actually believe? We don't know, and this is a problem with the source. We have to think about the genre of every source. Is it a forensic speech? Is there an agenda behind that? Is it comedy? What's the agenda behind that? Is it Xenophon who clearly has a very strongly held views on sex and gender and sexuality, and he does, believe me, in other writings of his, and his views seem to be somewhat unusual for people of his day. So there are problems with all these sources. Euripides is another one. We've seen how he, and we'll continue to see how he portrays women through a kind of the lens of psychological realism. But that was felt again to be different from the way that they should be portrayed. So he's painted as a misogynist in ancient Greece, though today we might see him almost as a proto-feminist. Plato probably was a proto-feminist and put forward some very advanced views about women and equality, and that would have been extremely out of step with the attitudes of his time, and he's aware of that. So in the Laws, when he discusses potential female equality, he tells the Athenian stranger, the character of the Athenian stranger tells the interlocutors, the people with whom he is speaking, be careful, with whom you discuss these things, because in certain cities, in certain places, it would be regarded very negatively indeed. He's aware that these views are not popular. So again, unusual. Aristotle is another one. Aristotle actually has quite a lot to say about gender and sex and sexuality. Unfortunately, he's also he is what we would call a misogynist. He seemed to believe that he wrote that women were basically malformed men. They were inferior versions of men. This idea would be picked up by later Christianity, with theologians like, I think Thomas Aquinas was one who argued that the woman's rib, because woman was made from the rib of Adam, she's a secondary creation somehow and less important. So again, every one of these sources, as with any primary source, when we're thinking about especially a topic as complicated as gender, we need to think about what we know about them, what they've said, who they are, what the genre is. Is it philosophy? Is it comedy? Is it a forensic speech or something else? Or is it poetry in the case of Sappho? Context is everything. Sappho was unique. She was a poetess. She was also the headmistress of a kind of finishing school for aristocratic girls. And her poetry suggests that she probably fell in love with some of her students. Did she actually, did they act out on this love, or did she simply write about it? We don't know. And I can say this too, that on the subject of what we would call lesbianism, the ancient Greeks are fairly silent. There is a presumption that what Sappho is describing, she's from the island of Lesbos, and that's the origin of the name, lesbian. But there's an assumption that what she's writing about is same-sex relations between women, but it seems to have been almost a taboo subject amongst the Greeks. You don't find a great deal written about this. I think they found it disturbing, or the Greek men seem to have found it disturbing. This was Kenneth Dover's view. I actually collared him once at a speech, or sorry, at a lecture he was giving back when he was still alive in St Andrews, and asked him this, and he agreed that it was a taboo subject. So we don't have a lot of information on female same-sex relations. We have a lot more on male same-sex relations because, as we've seen and will continue to see, that figures prominently into the culture. So a lot of what we know is deduction. It's based on snippets of information here and there. And this is true of a lot of things in the ancient Greek world, but it's especially true of gender issues. So, I mean, I talked about how we're not sure if women went to the theater, but in thinking about it, last time we saw that in praise of Dionysus, that apparently the Furies were so realistic when they were brought out on stage, a woman in the audience miscarried. Well, if that's true, then there were women in the audience. Pardon me. So I think that seems to suggest they were actually present, possibly sitting in the back. But anyway, like I say, we have to deduce an awful lot. Now, another thing that we can be fairly sure of is that attitudes towards gender, sex, marriage, sexuality varied from state to state. So we know already that Athens and Sparta addressed these things very differently. In the case of Athens, we know women can't vote. They're effectively second-class citizens. They tend to be less well-educated than men. We don't hear of women going to school in Athens. Schools are private, and they seem to be just for male students. If a woman receives an education, or a girl, she probably receives it from her mother or other women in the household, maybe her father. But it'll be mainly in things like reading and writing and numeracy, mathematics, because she would be expected one day to keep the household accounts. So just what she needs to function in her role as head of the household, or head of housekeeping, I suppose is the right term. We know that upper class women usually stay indoors or are chaperoned when they go outside, and usually wear a veil. We know that lower class women in Athens do go outside unattended and don't wear the veil, but then they get sometimes ridiculed for it or looked down upon by others. The private sphere of the oikos is the sphere of woman. This is not necessarily enshrined in law, and that's important to remember, that the kind of restrictions that Athens imposed on its women were not, the laws didn't specify these things, but custom did, and custom effectively had the force of law. And I suppose if it ever came to a legal test, they'd probably write a law if they needed to. and they couldn't attend court. A woman wasn't allowed to prosecute anyone or defend herself in court. If she was taken to court, she had to have a male relative to represent her. In the case of foreign women, if they had no male relatives in Athens and were considered kurios, guardians of themselves, and they could be. This is the funny thing about that. Foreign women residing in Athens could actually have more rights than native ones. If they were taken to court, they would need a sponsor or someone else, like a lawyer in effect, to represent them. And women in Athens aren't allowed to inherit property except through a nearest male relative. And I think I've said this before, if a woman's father died leaving an estate with no male heirs, then she would have to, if she was married, she would have to divorce her husband and then marry her nearest male relative in order for that property to pass through her, not to her, but through her, and it goes to him. So they're quite, citizen women are quite restricted. Foreign women resident in Athens are not so restricted, as we'll see. The most respectful way to address a woman, and we saw a bit of this with Pericles, was not to say what her name was. That could be quite dangerous. That would imply that she was known, she was in some sense common. You would indicate whose wife or daughter or sister she was. So if she was a proper woman, the public would not be expected to know her, but they would be expected to know her kurios, her guardian. This is, again, either her father, husband, or nearest male relative. Men, of course, by contrast, yes, they could vote, they could serve in the government, they could serve in the army, and worked mainly in the public sphere. They were expected to be tough and take up defense of the king of the realm or of the city-state in times of war. And we know that in terms of adultery, as we define it, a married man could have sexual relations with pretty much anyone else he wished, except for a married female citizen. That was what would get him into trouble. But he could have a prostitute, he could have a boyfriend, he could have a girlfriend, other than his wife, a mistress, or what have you. But anything but another married woman, or a citizen woman who was virgin and betrothed to someone else, that would also probably get him into trouble. Women, by contrast, the double standard, of course, is they're not allowed sexual relations with anyone apart from their husbands. And I'm talking about citizen women, of course, again, and mainly upper class ones. We suspect the rules were somewhat more lax at the lower levels. How does this compare with Sparta? Right? Well, the men in Sparta, they're expected to be tough, just like the Athenian ones, even more so, to a kind of absurd extreme, actually. Defend the polis. Sparta was still patriarchal. Women had a kurios, their father or husband, but the kurios's influence over them seems to have been less significant. So it wouldn't have been unusual for a Spartan father to betroth his daughter to someone just like an Athenian father would, but one suspects that the Spartan women would have had a bit more say in the matter. Maybe the Athenian women had some say in the matter too. We don't have evidence for that, though. We know that unlike their Athenian counterparts, Spartan women were educated at state expense. They were taught the use of weapons and riding and chariot driving. Essentially the same kind of military education, maybe not quite as intense, but a similar type of military education to what the men got. And this was, again, partly to keep the defense of the homeland when the Spartan men were away fighting, and to keep the slaves under control. We know that they can inherit property in Sparta. That's a big difference between Sparta and Athens. Women, and in fact Aristotle complains about something like a third of the land being owned by women in Sparta because of inheritance, so that they have a lot more franchisement. Now, of course, Sparta wasn't a democracy like Athens, but they did have an assembly, and we're not sure if women were allowed to attend the assembly, but I can't imagine they wouldn't be. I suspect they were allowed. I don't know. We can't prove that. They may have done so. We know about Queen Gorgo, right, who's a reigning monarch. If a woman can be a reigning monarch, then maybe women can be in the Apella. since the appellate doesn't really do anything apart from acclaim the decisions made by the council. And we've seen other things already about Sparta and the differences between Sparta and Athens. Now, Sparta and Athens will represent two ends of the extremes. Chances are that other city-states were somewhere in the middle. So if we went to some place like Taras, this is the, pardon me, excuse me, the Spartan colony in Italy, modern-day Taranto, and it's considered Sparta-light. So it retained a lot of characteristics of the Spartans, but was less militaristic, less dependent on slavery, although still dependent on slavery, and somewhat more progressive, I suppose, in engaging with the world around it. The women there probably enjoyed some similar freedoms to those in Sparta. And we don't know a lot about the differences between other city-states, except that they were different. So there might have been some in which women were not nearly as oppressed as in Athens, and probably certainly not nearly as free as in Sparta, but all sorts of things in between. So we know, for example, that in Thebes, despite being an aristocratic society ruled by an oligarchy, they seem to have been less snobbish about poverty and about citizens working. In Athens, they were rather snobbish about this. A citizen, or the ideal was that a citizen might own land, and have slaves working for him or other people or employees working for him. But to do actual labor for a citizen was considered kind of, beneath a lot of them. Or at least that seems to have been the attitude from the elites, from what we get. Thebes, on the other hand, appears to have been less. So they probably regarded women differently in Thebes as well. So what is the realm of woman? And again, back to Athens, because we know more about them. The two sort of big spheres are the public and private sphere. The oikos, the household, is the realm of woman, though it belongs to the man in Athens. Of course, women can't inherit property. Only foreign women seem to own property in Athens, so it's the male citizens who own the household. Pardon me. And the oikos includes not only human beings, like the people who make up the household, but property, and therefore, according to size and content, you could think of it as family, extended family, but also household or even estate. And as we've seen before, upper-class women in Athens appear to have been restricted mainly to the private sphere of the oikos. The exceptions to these things being funerals, weddings, and certain religious festivals like the Thesmophoria, which we've seen or will see. So upper-class women, at least, are sequestered or isolated in the household. Xenophon wrote in his Oikonomikos, "It is seemly for a woman to remain at home and not to be out of doors, but for a man to remain inside is a disgrace." So he reasserts this sort of essentialist position that a woman belongs in the household, dealing with the children, dealing with running the household and its goods and so forth. And the man belongs outside, whether working on the farm or in whatever public role he's got. So, and for an upper class woman as well, being seen in public might associate them with members of the lower class, might allow someone to confuse them with prostitutes. We're not entirely sure, but I mean, so for example, in a lot of the artwork, and you'll see some examples here, that depict men and women, the women are almost invariably portrayed as having very pale skin, because they stay indoors all the time. Remember in the assembly women, when the women take over the assembly, they disguise themselves as men, and the men ask, why are all these shoemakers here? Because, of course, shoemakers would be one of the few roles that men undertook that was indoors, and so they were more pale than the average man. That, again, is the ideal. As I say, lower class women will have worked in the public sphere, and they would have been not so pale, but that's again a class issue. So again, in the case of men in Athens, they are expected to be representatives of the vigorous elite, and to play an active role in the affairs of the polis, in the assembly, through serving in the military, public office, dealing with all these things, and many citizens did all those things. Women were, as a rule, not afforded the opportunity to do any of these things in the public sphere, and were not expected to be actively involved in these affairs. So, what was it like for them, though? What was childhood and marriage like for an Athenian citizen? We've seen a Spartan marriage already. In Athens, the division of the sexes extended also to education and sex role stereotyping, we might call it, as with societies today. But it started from a very early age. So boys would go to school about the age of 5 or 6, or they might be taught by a private tutor. Girls would at that point be taught household duties like weaving and cooking. And even amongst aristocratic households, upper-class women were expected to be skilled at weaving and cooking. Girls typically got married in their teens. We saw Ischomachus' wife in the Oikonomikos is about 15. Men usually got married in their 30s, and the marriage would be betrothed by her father, her kurios. She might not be involved in that whole process. She would probably be informed of it, but there's very little ceremony for marriage in ancient Greece, or in ancient Athens anyway. So there's a ceremony called the inge, and this is where the father officially betroths in front of witnesses his daughter to another man. That had to be witnessed by men. The wife-to-be might not be present at the betrothal. It's an official, a kind of registration ceremony, a registration of intent, almost like a legal contract that, and at that point the father would offer a dowry as well. That goes with the wife. Now, the dowry remains her property, in theory. It's though overseen by her husband after they're married, and the children are meant to inherit it. And if they divorce, the husband has to give back the dowry. So wives could use this as a way to exert perhaps some sort of control over her husband. But so after the betrothal ceremony, then the marriage date would be set. It would be a relatively private family affair. There would be a feast and a celebration, and there's not a priest coming in to officiate. This is not sanctioned by. I mean, it would be officially sanctioned, I suppose, by the religion, but there's not a ceremony that we know of that involves a priest giving a blessing. There might be a priest there, giving a blessing, but it's not required. And what seems to mark the beginning of the marriage is when the husband carries the wife over the threshold in a symbolic act of rape, we might say, and they go to live in the same house together. So part of what defines marriage seems to be living in the same house as married. It's almost like a private arrangement, but one officially recognized. Again, the inge, that ceremony is registered with officials, and the fact that two people are married would be registered somewhere. So if a divorce happens, then the kurios of the bride has to go and make the appropriate change to the official records. And as I've said, a woman, if a woman was caught in adultery, she wouldn't suffer the same penalty as a man, which could vary from death to a hefty fine, but she would be divorced, and they made this distinction. So in the case of rape, a woman was not considered guilty. That was something that someone did to her. She didn't go willingly. But if she goes willingly into adultery, if she is seduced, as they called it, then her mind was seen to have been damaged, so that she would no longer be faithful to her husband. And therefore, not only would she be divorced, but she would likely be barred from ever marrying anyone else again. And even if she wasn't officially barred, chances are nobody would want to marry her, because she would be perceived to be damaged goods. She might also be banned from all the public festivals that made life worthwhile for particularly upper-class women. So in the case of an adulteress, getting caught could be a particularly harsh punishment. But as I say, the husband would be required to return the dowry, and if the dowry was quite large, there might be incentive for him to ignore the fact that his wife was having adultery. We know what the law says. We know some court cases that actually happened, but as to what really happened in society, I guarantee you it's not so straightforward as some of these, some of the accounts that we have make it out to be. And again, we get a good idea of what a kind of upper class family would be like from Xenophon's Oikonomikos. But it's written, as I say, it's written specifically as a kind of guidebook for members of the upper classes, and that's important to remember. It's not indicative of what the whole society believed or what they practiced. It is putting forward an aristocratic ideal that reflects Xenophon's own class and his own views to no small extent. But it does give us an indication of the level of learning available to Athenian citizen women. And note that throughout it, the wife is never named. She's just referred to as Eskomokos' wife. And we know that she's had some limited education before marriage, but not a lot. And her husband's going to train her up in some activities. And here's this kind of essentialist statement that he makes about, gender roles. So this is in the notes, but from Book 7, he says, "But whereas both of these, the indoor and the outdoor occupations alike, demand new toil and new attention to meet the case, God made provision from the first by shaping, as it seems to me, the woman's nature for indoor and the man's for outdoor occupations. Man's body and soul he furnished with a greater capacity for enduring heat and cold, wayfaring and military marches, or, to repeat, he laid upon his shoulders the outdoor works. While in creating the body of woman with less capacity for these things, God would seem to have imposed on her the indoor works, and knowing that he had implanted in the woman and imposed upon her the nurture of newborn babies, he endowed her with a larger share of affection for the newborn child than he bestowed upon man. And since he imposed on women the guardianship of the things imported from without, God in his wisdom, perceiving that a fearful spirit was no detriment to guardianship, endowed the woman with a larger measure of timidity than he bestowed upon man," etc., etc. And man, he says, has the larger share of courage. Well, I know some female rugby players who would differ with this. But this is what I mean by an essentialist view. They're made that way. This is what he's saying. And note that he seems to think that men have, less capacity for feelings and fuzzy feminine stuff like that. They're better suited for fighting. But this is the way that this is what I mean about gender roles being constructed by society. Society tells you these things from an early age. People believe it. They act this way. So, and you see an example of what would be an upper class Greek house in the slide there. Some of the rooms would be devoted just to the man, and some would be the women's quarters, though the man would be allowed, the husband could obviously go into the women's quarters whenever he wanted, but those were for sort of raising the children. The wife, we learn also, would be responsible for looking after the slaves in the household and taking care of them when they got sick. It's a big role she has to perform. This is, much of this is made in Aristophanes' Lysistrata. And I mentioned the religious festivals that go on. I put in quite a lot about the Thesmophoria, which is a festival to Demeter and Persephone. Is to Demeter Thesmophoros, Demeter the law-bearer, or who bears custom. Lawgiver might be a way of thinking about it. And I've put in detail what they got up to during this festival. It involves a fast and a feast, but all women only, and again, citizen women who haven't been barred because they've not committed adultery, coming together for these events, for the purposes of fertility. And then snakes are involved as well, suggesting that the religious rite might go back to the Bronze Age. We know that in earlier periods, women had a lot more active roles in religion and society more broadly. This seems to be a leftover from that, and there are other examples as well. So Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, practiced a kind of orgiastic, snake worshipping cultic practice, and again probably derived from the Bronze Age. And it's the Thesmophoria which features into the Aristophanes play Women at the Thesmophoria that we'll be looking at some point soon. The other one is funerals, and this also might be a leftover from the earlier days when women played a bigger role in religion. So, but women do play a major role at the funerals. They are responsible for preparing the body. We know that Solon introduced some restrictions in the 6th century on mourning because women were making excessive shows of mourning at the funerals, and certain restrictions, and also offering lots of goods as grave goods, perhaps to show off status. Women were expected to carry the libations. This is wine to be poured out in honor of the dead, at the front of the group, and this is the only time that we know of where women led, where they were followed by everyone else. Probably the only time that they were allowed to do this. So something like the Thesmophoria or the funerary practices are some of the few instances in which women, especially upper class women, engage in the public sphere. There's a ceremony every few years where the aristocratic women of Athens make a giant peplos, a giant gown for the goddess Athena, and they carry it up in a procession to the Parthenon up the Acropolis hill and present it to the goddess. So again, these are some of the few instances when those women go out in the public sphere. As I say, there are lower class women who do engage in the public sphere. So I'm going to talk about prostitutes now, and even though the notes tell you some things, I'm going to have to actually make a slight, when we come to Hetaira, a slight correction. So a kind of, well, Bear has some things to say about prostitutes. So there's a kind of two-type model with with women, I suppose. The kind of grouped into the category, and this is Athens in particular, we're talking about of wives and others. So we know the sort of rules that apply to wives. What sort of rules apply to the other women? The other women are going to be either prostitutes or foreign women who maybe even business women, but who aren't citizens. And in the case of prostitutes, they're referred to as porni. This is the word that gives us pornography. And it comes from a verb meaning to sell. Often the lower class prostitutes are slaves owned by a pimp. The Greek word is pornovoskos. The pimp might be male or female. These people, and they charge fees for sex. There's a whole section of the city, the Kerameikos, where ceramics are produced, that was notorious for prostitutes. And in theory, no Athenian citizen should have ever been made into a prostitute. And this applied to men as well as women. But in fact, because we know infants were often exposed or abandoned, often if they were female, they would have been picked up by the pornoboskos and raised as a slave to be a prostitute. So they charge money for sex, and some might eventually become wealthy enough to buy their freedom and become brothel maidens or madams themselves. We know that during the time of Solon, the state actually subsidized the brothels, believing them to be a public good, a release for the Athenian male population. And a very democratic thing. I put some more in the notes about that. We know that some of the prostitutes wore sandals that had inscriptions reading "Follow me," so they would, if you saw that in the sand, you would know, if you followed those footsteps, you could find a prostitute. Foreign women would sometimes become prostitutes as well. We know about older ones who were poor widows, and sometimes slaves buying back their freedom. But again, in Athens, prostitutes had to be registered with the city. They had to pay a special tax. They were afforded protections by law as well. They weren't allowed to be abused. It was treated as a profession. And there was a city official in charge of supervising them. if you hear about references to flute girls in some of the readings, the flute girls, these are women who play the flute, but they're almost invariably prostitutes who would be brought into a party or a symposium or something like that with men to entertain, but also for sexual purposes. Now, the next type, and you'll hear in the primary sources references to hetaira. The word means companion. It literally just means companion. And the traditional view is that these are upper class women, foreign women almost invariably, who are more like courtesans or geishas and charge a very high fee for their sexual favors. In fact, new evidence and new arguments are casting some shadow of doubt on this. It looks like most of what we've been classifying as hetaira, female companions whom we thought were some kind of prostitute, may in fact have chosen with whom they had sex, and that's different from an ordinary prostitute who doesn't get to choose for the most part. And they may not have taken money for sex. They may have just lived with rich men who gave them nice presents. Part of the confusion comes about from Roman law, which conflates the notion of a woman who is free with her sexuality with a prostitute, and thus we still use the word whore in English to refer to someone who's not taking money for sex, but is seen to be a woman who is seen to be free with her sex. So it may be that these weren't actually prostitutes, the hetaira, that they were wealthy, upper class, foreign women, usually extremely well educated, who then get attached to extremely wealthy men who are their lovers, and they're choosing them. In fact, a lot of the evidence we have suggests they chose the men that they were with. So that's again different. Did they receive gifts? Yes, but so for example, would we take Alice Perrers, the mistress of Edward III in the 14th century, to be a prostitute? She was a lady in waiting to the queen. She was the lover of the king. He gave her presents. Was it presents in exchange for sex? That's a different matter altogether. She wasn't classed as a prostitute. So, and it's a kind of double standard, really. One rule is applied to men who are free with their sexuality and another with women. So you'll read the notes, but hetaira probably aren't prostitutes. We know of a number of famous ones, though. Espazia, the mistress of Pericles, she's a foreign woman from Thebes, I think, and she probably wrote most of his speeches for him. She was extremely well educated, and it's funny that these upper-class Athenian men are looking for educated women when they can't find them in their own city. Their customs and traditions make them non-existent. He will eventually marry her, and despite having a citizenship law that says both parents have to be citizens, he gets a decree passed in the assembly to make his children citizens by Espazia. So one rule for them, another for the rest of us. There are other examples too. There's Phryne, who was from Thebes, and again, the fact that a number of these seem to come from Thebes suggests maybe their attitudes to women were different. But she was fabulously wealthy, famously, and she's in the 4th century. Famously, Alexander the Great destroyed the walls of Thebes. She had them rebuilt at her own expense, we're told, and every corner or every other brick or something had to have the inscription "Destroyed by Alexander the Great, rebuilt by Phryne the hetaira," which has usually been translated as Phryne the whore, but I don't think that's appropriate anymore. There are others as well, and I put these in the notes. Phryne was famously the model for Aphrodite. I've told you about how her advocate, she's accused of being involved in a murder. Her advocate strips her naked in front of the Areopagus, and they find her innocent. I'm not saying she was innocent. She might not have been, but it's an interesting story, and again reveals volumes about attitudes to gender in Athens. There were male prostitutes in Athens and elsewhere too. These are men who, like their female equivalent, are often slaves. They might be free as well, as long as they're not citizens, and they could even be citizens as long as they're not running for public office or trying to speak to the assembly. But and again, the law protected them just as it did women. We'll see in the case against Timarchus that that Timarchus, as I say, is a prominent politician who's accused of having taken money for sex, and as a consequence is barred for a time from public speaking. There appear to have been no prostitutes in Sparta, interestingly enough. The Spartans also had a much more liberal attitude towards sex, it seems. Well, liberal maybe is not the right term, but anyway, maybe. So we know that a lot of the Spartan men, or we're told that they engaged in same-sex relations from an early age. The Spartan women may have done the same. They don't seem to have been as uptight about marital fidelity either. In fact, we hear of instances of wife sharing at certain times, or husband sharing when there's a need to replenish the population. So the common people in Sparta, or the citizens mainly, don't seem to have been that concerned about the same issues as the Athenians were, except for the monarchy, except for the royal families. That's where issues like adultery became important, because of course their offspring had to be legitimate. Pardon me. The royal families in Sparta are a bit like celebrities too, so they're under public scrutiny in different ways from those of ordinary citizens, pardon me, and different expectations about them. So Alcibiades sleeping with a Spartan member of the royal household was a very bad thing indeed. Had it been any other Spartan citizen woman, it might not have mattered, but it might not have as much. But because it was royalty that he slept with, that got him into trouble. So we talk about, as I say, there are male prostitutes, and don't appear to have ever been any in Sparta of either type. So again, back to this notion of gender construction. The masculine and the feminine are constructed products of Greek society, just as in any society. How did it work? Well, a lot of it was on mythical lines. So a man should be like Odysseus or Achilles or Heracles or someone like that. An exemplar from mythology would be dredged up. Be tough, be manly, be courageous, those sorts of things. Be clever, like Odysseus. For women, again, it's female counterparts from mythology. So the ideal woman should be like Persephone, right? Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, who waits patiently for her husband to return home, tries to fend off the suitors who are trying to usurp his position, a good and faithful wife, but still clever enough to test him when he gets back to make sure that he's actually her husband before she gets into bed with him. So we get those sorts of views. Obviously, there are lots of negative views about women too. You have Clytemnestra, whom we've already seen, and there'll be others, as Medea is another one we'll encounter. The sort of characteristics that go with masculinity are things like Andrea. This is the Greek word for courageousness, but it literally means manliness. So courage and being a man are intrinsically linked. A negative attribute, the opposite of Andrea often, is malakia, which means softness. That's associated with women. And it's not just physical softness. It has to do with like lack of control over desire, that sort of thing. And women are seen to have an insatiability, an aplastia in Greek. Aristotle says this, and he's not the only one, that they can't resist. They've got such a strong urge and enjoy sex so much that they can't resist the pleasure of it. Manly self-mastery is sort of the key to understanding ancient attitudes on gender. So a man should be able to master his own desire for sexual pleasure. If he can't be a master of himself, how can he be master of other people? So someone who lacks that control would be seen as feminine. Alcibiades, because of his sexual proclivities, would be seen as feminine. Doesn't matter that he's sleeping with women. He can be sleeping with women or men. This lack of self-control makes him effeminate because he's soft. He can't resist pleasure like a man should. Now, we may point out that the hypocritical character of these things. And I certainly wouldn't want to be either male or female in ancient Athens, I think. But it's worth mentioning, and Sir Kenneth Dover talks about this in his writing too. And I don't agree 100% with his theory of ancient Greek homosexuality at all. But he was a very intelligent scholar, and he picked up on a lot of key points. The continued existence of a Greek city-state, as Dover writes, depended ultimately on the military qualities of its adult male citizens. As we've seen, right, a military defeat could and often did result in the physical destruction of the fabric of the city itself, and sometimes in consequence the mass slaughter of all adult male citizens and the enslavement of the women and children. So those were the odds. That's what was at stake, and part of the reason for these particular constructions of gender have to do with the need to defend the city-state against others who want to come in and do these things to it. Athens alone was at war no less than 3 out of every 4 years between 500 and 322 BC. So 3 out of every 5 years, or sorry, 3 out of every 4 years rather. So encouragements for young men to become manly warriors must have been pretty intense. I'm not justifying it, I'm simply saying this is the way it was. And by contrast, the need for women to produce offspring to refill the ranks of the citizens was fairly important. So again, effeminate men, right? Agathon is considered effeminate. Agathon is probably gay in modern our understanding of these things. They didn't possess this concept. But by action, by practice, he would probably be exclusively homosexual. Most ancient Greeks would have been probably what we consider bisexual. Some would have been heterosexual. So Xenophon seems to be pretty fiercely heterosexual. He writes about not enjoying same-sex relations, and so there's a spectrum then as now. But one could be, as we would think of as, what we think of as gay, and still not be seen as effeminate. Effeminacy again comes down to this notion of lacking self-control, as opposed to being in control. So men like Alcibiades are seen to be lacking in self-control. Timarchus and Agathon as well, because of his somewhat, the fact that he works indoors, he doesn't go outside and work. He's in the arts. He's very into feelings and things like that. But it's a mistake to associate their view of effeminacy with, as some have done, as Sir Kenneth Dover did, as Michel Foucault did, working with Dover, to regard effeminate men as passive penetrateds, as they tried to do. And the evidence doesn't actually bear it out. The zero-sum construction, that in a same-sex relationship, the penetrative partner gets everything out of it, the penetrated gets nothing. The ancient Greeks didn't think this way. There is ample evidence to say that both partners enjoyed it. And Plato actually condemns the active and passive, or the penetrator and the penetrated, because of how much pleasure they're both getting out of it. And the penetrated actually gets more pleasure, he says. So that view is, I think, skewed. And Timarchus is often has been used by scholars up until relatively recent times to say, well, Timarchus must be a passive penetrated. But in fact, in the speech of Aeschines, we find that Timarchus enjoys having sex with female prostitutes. So he's probably not a passive penetrator. Anyway, we can talk more about these things in class. But again, these conceptions of effeminacy versus manliness or courageousness, they're very different than how we think of them. And being effeminate means lacking self-control, which makes them more like a woman, right? Because women are perceived to lack self-control for sex, for wine, pleasure generally. And that makes them a bit more like a slave, because slaves have to be controlled, right? They can't control themselves. This seems to be the kind of mentality behind it. And lastly, there are the Amazons. What are we to make of the Amazons? There's a fascination on the part of the Athenians in particular with Amazons. They're featured in the carvings on on the Parthenon. There's a famous war where Theseus, remember him, the king, defeats the Amazon queen Hippolyta and makes her his wife. When the Amazons invade Athens, that's recorded. There's a fascination with Amazons, and of course Athens has as its patron goddess Athena, a woman who wears armor and knows military strategy, which seems to fly utterly in the face of their all their attitudes towards gender roles. What does this say? I think it shows something. It's revealing something in their psychology. I mean, in the case of the Amazons, they appear to exist, at least in the sort of realm of fiction, or myth, as women that need to be conquered, right? So Theseus conquers them and then makes Hippolyta his wife. So that's how they seem to view the Amazons. But Athena is a virgin, and they respect her virginity. So again, this fascination with warrior women seems to be revealing of something psychologically, though I'm not entirely sure what. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll leave it there, and we'll discuss some of these issues in more detail in the seminar. Goodbye for now.